The registrations are under progress, and I request all professionals and top management to sponsor their professional employees and to join our forthcoming certification courses. Today's technical webinar will focus on 5-dimensional project management strategies for complex projects. Our speaker name is Douglas Gransberg, who is a PhD PE and an F.ASCE. Mr. Douglas Gransberg is the president of Gransberg and Associated Incorporated, a construction management and project delivery consulting firm. GNA has been retained by 24 state departments of transportation as a project delivery consultant and has assisted 4 states in the US in changing their enabling legislation to permit alternative project delivery methods. In 2017, he retired from his position as a full professor and the Donald and Sharon Greenwood Inwood Chair of Construction Engineering at Iowa State University. Before moving to academia in 1994, he spent over 20 years in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, where he completed his first design-build project in 1985. He also has published more than 200 journals articles, as well as 4 books on the subject of alternative project delivery. Once again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope this webinar will be beneficial for you for your professional excellence. Mr. Douglas, you may start.
Salam alaikum, shukran. Doug Gransberg, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And try to get it into, there we go. Yeah, I had the, during my first life, I spent well over 2 years living in Tehran, working all over the kingdom, as well as around the Middle East. And as I moved into my second career in academia and consulting, I found that there were an awful lot of complex projects that I had dealt with, and feel like we really didn't have the tools to deal with. So what I'm going to do now is get into the results of a major research project that we accomplished to look at project management strategies for complex projects. The result of that was coming up with this framework of 5-dimensional project management. Let me see if I can get my laser pointer. There we go. Okay.
That's your question in the allotted time. It will be answered in a separate email.
Okay. Just to show you some of the experiences we've had, we implemented this probably 8-9 years ago, and I'm currently working. My company is with the Georgia Department of Transportation on an $11 billion program, where we literally started with 5 DPM from scratch. You can see the other ones. I won't go through all of them. Bottom line, by starting with this slide, is what I'm about to show you isn't theoretical. What I'm about to show you is something that has been applied on a variety of projects, a variety of sizes, not just infrastructure, but other kinds of projects that and is found to be useful. So project complexity, in Australia, they have a group called the College of Complex Project Managers. And this was a group that was founded based on the premise that complex project management is different than routine project management, and that it can be differentiated by a couple of things. First is this degree of disorder, instability, uncertainty, other kind of things, you'll find that the rest of the presentation is going to be focused a lot on uncertainty. And then, you know, that is the uncertainty of what the objectives are, or having a high uncertainty of just how to achieve the objectives. So that's the idea that we'll be focusing on here, is that complex project management is all about handling certainty versus uncertainty. And so often we use risk and uncertainty in the same sentence to mean the same thing, and there isn't. What I'm going to show you on this slide was published by Bob Prieto just recently. In fact, like 2 weeks ago. And I think he did a really nice job of kind of defining the difference. And we have to be very cognizant in complex project management of differentiating between risk and uncertainty. You know, risk is measurable uncertainty, whereas uncertainty is immeasurable risk. In risk, we can point to a situation where there's a chance that something bad will happen. In uncertainty, it's just a condition where future outcomes are undefinable and potentially unrecognized. The COVID pandemic was a great example of uncertainty. With risk, the project manager can choose to do something about it, to accept, transfer, avoid, mitigate, lots of things we've learned to do. That AACE has produced documents and various recommended practices for dealing with that. But unfortunately, uncertainty is just something you're going to have to deal with when the circumstance happens. And so no matter how good an engineer or a project manager, or, you know, unless you're a clairvoyant and can predict the future, you're always going to have to deal with uncertainty. And then fundamentally, that last bullet here, I think, is where we come to a good definition. With risk, I can define a range of probable outcomes. And in Bob's words, we don't know what is going to happen next, but we do know what the distribution looks like. Whereas in uncertainty, the probabilities are unknown. We don't know what is going to happen next, and we do not know what the possible distribution looks like. So kind of keeping that definition in the back of our minds, we'll move forward with this presentation. Just looking at what's a traditional project versus a complex project. Traditional projects, all the rules apply. You know, we can do the things we're used to doing. We can rely on the you know, historic data, those kinds of things, and expect it to be reasonably correlated with what will probably happen on the project that we're managing at hand. We have static interactions. So if we increase the amount of time we spend developing the project, that generally means we're going to increase the cost. Time equals money, those types of rules of thumbs. And however, in complex projects, we, even though we usually start out trying to use standard practices, we find out we have to modify what we're doing to be successful. And that's normally because we have a lot of dynamic interactions, you know, by picking a certain financing vehicle, that may drive what the construction schedule becomes, just because the availability of funds is not as in a traditional project. The idea is that if we have enough funding, we can build exactly what we want, and everything, we can buy everything that we need. And so that leads us into this idea of having a high level of uncertainty as compared to a traditional project regarding what the final objective will be, or how to implement the steps to achieve those objectives. Excuse me. So getting back to the Australians, they've got a couple of definitions or a couple of other points I think that are worth making. And one is that the level of uncertainty, which essentially becomes the complexity of a project, is going to vary with the maturity of the individual or the organization. It was mentioned that I did my first design build project back in 1985, and that actually, I believe, was at King Khalid Military City. It was in Saudi somewhere. We worked on a lot of projects. But at that time, I'd never done design build before. I've always had done design bid build. And so a design build project was a very complex effort because my level and my organization's level of organizational maturity was low with regard to that particular feature. Whereas today, 2022, I've been involved in billions of dollars. However, I continue to provide advice to clients that are doing their first design build project. So the difference in complexity for me is a function of the fact that I've got 30 years of experience dealing with it, where they're just starting. And really the key definition here, I think, or the key thing is that uncertainty is that all those things that are going to have to be dealt with to make the project successful, that are outside the project manager's control. And so the CCPM likes to call that managing on the edge of chaos. And so that's the graphic here, you know. This is chaos. This is order. And a complex project manager, his job is to keep the project right on that line there, even though he or she cannot control everything that needs to be accomplished in order to finish the project. What causes complexity? You know, I love this graphic. This is a reference to the bureaucratic red tape here in the United States. Every country has its own series of red tape. You know, the difference between what you have in your budget versus what you need to build a project that's there. You know, the unexpected denial of a permit, for instance. You know, it's just all those different kind of things. We tend to focus on technical things, but in the end of the day, a lot of these things that are here, these third-party type issues, are the things that end up driving a complex project. And so the questions, you know, how can a project manager manage complexity in a mega project? The project I'm showing here on the right is the Panama Canal expansion project. You know, we had the good fortune of being involved with that particular project from the very start and all the way through completion. You know, extremely complex project. So if you're going to manage it, how can you measure it? Didn't I just say that uncertainty was immeasurable? Well, uncertainty is, but complexity may not be. And so can we use that measurement as a way to track the change in complexity? So the idea being that early on in a project, we have lots of uncertainty. That uncertainty leads to lots of complexity. And so the project manager at that point has the ability to apply resources to reduce complexity. So if it's a matter of not understanding geotechnical characteristics or understanding what the way a certain regulation is going to be applied to this particular project, rather than waiting until it's later in the project, by applying some resources, getting out there and starting the geotechnical study now rather than waiting until the typical routine time would be, or by getting somebody to go to the appropriate third-party stakeholder that has the ability to stonewall the project and figuring out exactly what does this regulation going to mean to us for our particular project, allows us to hopefully reduce the complexity. So what I'm showing here, this is a graphic, came from the report cited to the left. This was all done doing under a Strategic Highway Research Program project. What we found there were 5 actual dimensions of complexity. Now there's the typical iron triangle, the kind of thing that AACE or PMI goes into great detail, and this is for the typical project. What we found was that by adding context and finance, we now had the makings of a complex project. And the idea there being, in the routine project, the final product will be a function of the required capacity, the design loads, those kinds of things. Whereas in a complex project, we may not be allowed to build exactly what we want because of environmental restrictions, social restrictions. We might not be able to build it as fast as we'd like it because financial, which is how we're going to pay for it, versus cost, which is just how much is the current scope of work worth, is going to drive our construction schedule. It's the ability to get the money in time to be able to buy the materials and pay the contractors. So just to kind of go over just what the various dimensional factors are, with this group, certainly schedule factors are very well understood. There might be statutory limits in terms of requirements for how long you would have to advertise a project, how many tender offers you have to receive to be able to demonstrate competition. Right now here in the U.S., I think one of the biggest issues we have, and I don't know if it's extended across into the Arabian Peninsula, but apparently we have a lot of money available and not enough contractors and engineers to be able to actually award all that work to. And so suddenly the schedule factors are starting to drive things like finance. So if you can't start the project for 2 years because of the availability of qualified contractors, what does that do to your budget? Please mute your microphone if you're listening. Thank you very much. Same thing with technical things. We have a lot of different deals. Do we need to come up with something other than the standard, lowest tender offer type of an approach? Do we need the designer and the builder to work on the same team? You get into the context. These are all the things that are outside most project managers' direct control. Political procurement constraints that are being placed on the system, and whether that's a commercial or a public project, doesn't matter. Those constraints are still there. Environmental issues, if the project is of the right kind of nature. Public perception, that's a huge one right now in the US, as well as a couple of the other countries where we're working on projects. Availability of real estate and the speed with which you can actually acquire the necessary land on which to build. sustainability in terms of environmental impact and those things. And then one that's very rarely recognized, that came out very clearly in the research, and I can tell you in my consulting practice, this is probably the most difficult hurdle, is owner preferences and biases. It's we've never done it that way. Why would we change? Well, you hired me to help you improve your project management system, and you can't improve it by doing exactly the same thing. Improvement means doing something different. And then on the bias side, it has to be done this way, or we will never allow the use of this type of an approach. And then, things like all the other things we need to make the project smoke and quiver with regard to utilities and the other things that relate to the project. And this is just an example, came out of one of the projects that we sampled in the Sharp 2 thing. I think it's a great example of what context really means. This was the picture of a project opponent's blog, for this Lewis and Clark Bridge over in Oregon. Basically the picture says, what's the estimated completion date? Never. And so, that's an example of complexity, of a context complexity that wasn't well managed. So how does a project manager do anything other than think unkind thoughts about the person that is posting the blog? Well, perhaps we need to consider things like, one of the reasons they're worried about it is there's a hospital on one side of the bridge. And when you close the bridge, the ambulances can't get to the hospital. So getting into cost and finance, as I said, a lot of folks will roll those into the same dimension, and in reality, they really need to be considered separately. This is what your certified cost professional does, develops the estimates, looks at scope of work, your quantity surveyors, those kind of things. And what it does is determine how much funding is required for the scope of work as presented at this point in time. Financing is, where's the money going to come from? What's the schedule of availability in many public sector projects that go from fiscal year to fiscal year? We have restrictions that in like U.S. public projects, multi-year projects will be awarded with the ubiquitous term contingent upon availability of funds. So, if we get to the end of this fiscal year, we just assume that the U.S. Congress is going to pass the budget for next fiscal year. And if for some reason there's a holdup, we might actually have a pause in project progress. And then the blending of public and private money is something that's been done not only in the U.S. but worldwide. Been in a couple of public-private partnerships in Australia and New Zealand area. This is just an example of a project that was a complex project that was driven by finances. And I think the key point here, even though this is a prettier picture, we talk about different colors of money. There were literally many different sources of funding. Each one had its own color in this particular graph. And it showed when those particular pots of money were available. That actually drove the construction schedule. So instead of starting at one end of the project and working to the other, as you would normally expect, this thing has a tunnel involved in it right in here. Kind of see where there's this nice green spot over the highway. They ended up not starting with the tunnel, which was the intent, but having to start elsewhere and then bring the tunnel in. That created a very interesting complexity in how you manage the schedule based on how you pay for work complete. So theoretically, when we start talking about the interactions between the 5 dimensions, you know, as an academic, I would want to draw it up like this. You know, it'd be real easy for my undergraduate students to understand. But as a working professional who's managed complex projects, in reality, what we have is something more like this. Each thing, if you know, it's kind of like putting up a tent. If you raise one pole, that means another pole, things go slack. And if you go raise that one and tighten this rope, the bottom line is it's highly interactive, it's highly recursive, and it's very difficult to plan long-term to deal with complexity. So what we're trying to deal with here is to ultimately, given the fact that the PM will have to manage things that it cannot control, then it must make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. And so the upshot of 5D-PM is a change in the paradigm of from going from cost and schedule savings, you know, let's save as much money and save as much time, to focus on maximizing cost and schedule certainty. So rather than trying to build the project as cheaply as possible, as fast as possible, what we're saying is we develop a project that has a high probability of finishing on budget, on time. And what's wrong with that? If we spend every last, you know, penny that's in the budget, and we get a project that does exactly what we're wanting to, and it's open on the date that we said we were going to have it open on, I would say that's probably a definition of success. Unfortunately, a lot of the things we do in our current project management philosophy are things where we're trying to save money, where we're trying to save time, and often that suboptimizes what we're doing. So that's the key thing. We're going to focus on cost and schedule certainty. And so the idea here is it's a dynamic process. We're going to identify those areas of complexity early, try to quantify, if possible, its potential impact on project performance, and then actively manage it by making proactive resource allocation, early decision-making. The Georgia project that I'm currently still involved with, one of the areas of complexity had to do with the procurement law in the state of Georgia. It became very clear that to obey the law would prevent us from achieving one of our critical success factors, which was to have all these projects awarded within 5 years. That's $11 billion worth of complex projects. That's a tough ask. However, by making a change to one of the provisions inside that law, suddenly it became possible. So one of our early decisions was to change the law, which everybody, no, you can't change the law. That's the law. You have to obey it. Well, the state legislature changes the law every year when it's in session. So changing the law is not something that's, it's not easy, but it's certainly possible. And we were able to do that once we got the necessary political support. But the idea is if we had waited even 1 year, we would have failed. It's because we didn't make that decision in a condition of uncertainty. You know, the picture of the lady pointing thumbs down, you know, couldn't afford for that to happen. So that's really what it's at. This is just a framework. By the way, that report is available for free download online at the Transportation Research Board website. This is just taken from it. The idea is we came up with 5 methods that would allow us to develop strategies to manage complexity. In between, we had tools that could be used, identified in the original research 13. Since then, it's more than doubled. I'm sure there's even more that can be used. The idea is ultimately what we're trying to do is come up with this collection of strategies for managing complexity that can be built into the final project management plan. And so here's just a list of tools. I'm not going to go over each one of these. You'll notice we have this comprehensive risk analysis. That doesn't mean you can't manage risk just because you've got some uncertainty. You know, it's all about figuring out what is it you know, what is it you don't know. Making a decision to design to a budget rather than to design and then do a cost estimate and then see if you can get more money if you need it. Using data-driven, risk-based top-down estimating early on to help create a credible range and a statistical level of confidence of what that baseline budget probably could be. And rather than turning it into a single number, letting it be a range for the life of the project until we've finished the design. This is an example of one of the many tools. I'm a civil engineer by education, a construction engineer also by education. I've got my PhD and master's degrees are in. But if I had to be a real engineer, I'd be a geotechnical engineer because that's kind of where most of my expertise is. But at the end of the day, the issue with design is that you have to make the decision as to when you're done designing. What we've found in complex projects, if you talk about when do we need to know whether or not we are going to found the bridge on bedrock or friction piles, that by giving that date visibility, we can then plan all the associated risks that go behind it. And so just coming up with this design decision register. And again, this will be in that report if you're interested in looking these things up. Another one is looking at risk exposure. You know, when are we exposed to the underground risk? Well, the day we start digging. When are we no longer exposed to that risk? Well, the day we finish digging. And so by looking at that as a period of time in which that risk can occur, we can then back out of that and say, okay, is there a way for us to make that risk go away? In the Georgia project, we had a number of really small bridges that had to go across, multi-lane freeways in urban areas, Atlanta, Savannah, places like that. Do you really need an extensive geotechnical study for please mute your phone, whoever's on. Yeah, thank you. We already had, we knew what the geologic profile was, and we made the decision, and this is a 5 DPM type of decision, to go ahead and invest in schedule certainty by just making a design decision that we wouldn't try to come up with the cheapest foundation. We would just require these things to be founded on bedrock. At the end of the day, across all those projects, that saved 2 years in development process, just in geotechnical studies that didn't need to be done. So, you know, looking for that opportunity to be able to retire a risk by making a design decision that increases schedule certainty allowed us to actually accrue some very significant benefits. If you look at it, can it be measured? Well, in a routine project, it's a linear thing. You know, we have a technical requirement, translates to the scope of work. And once we've got that figured out, we know how much it costs and how long it's going to take for us to design and build. However, conceptually, in the 5DPM mode, if you take the available funds, okay, how much money can you get for this particular project? And the context, which is what are those things that they will or will not let you build? That then gives you a possible scope of work, which then becomes your technical requirement that drives cost and schedule. So what we're really doing is trying to start out on this end and recognize that if the environmental situation is such that we're not going to be allowed to you know, drive piles in a river, then let's not start out with driving, you know, a plan that says we're going to drive piles in a river. Let's figure out how we're going to be able to do that without that, so that we can get that context piece out of the way and get a technical solution, a technical scope of work that will be responsive to the environmental constraints. And so how do you do that? Well, we got a tool, we call it complexity mapping. Basically, you know, we run these exercises. Again, I'll just refer to Georgia because that's where we've been doing most of this recently. Going through in that guidebook all these different checklists. We then rate each of the factors that were found in each dimension against the scale where 50 is a routine complexity. You know, if we always have the money, then we would have 50% complexity. And if we're not sure how much money we need at this stage, then maybe our complexity would be higher. And then we use this map, we put it onto the spider diagram. And so the idea here is that we can come up with a subjective measure of complexity. And so if we start out with that workshop, we're looking at, you know, what's the difference between average complexity, the area inside the footprint. If it was all 50 would be about 6,000 units. And if it was all 100, in other words, as complex as it could be, it'd be about 24,000. In this case, we end up with 13,000 or so at that early stage. And then we've got a couple of dimensions of finance and public information that are ones that are driving the major amount of complexity. We work on the project for a while. We try to manage complexity. We figured out the finance now. It's dropped. Now we've got some public information and permits. Again, still some complexity. If you measure the footprint, it's been reduced. Now there's absolutely no, I mean, those units are just indices. They're not, there's no precise measurements being made here. And then last but not least, you know, you work your way through. And the idea is that if at this point we realize that, okay, here's where we're doing it, here's where we need to put our resources. You know, this is the thing that's causing complexity. Well, by golly, by the time we hit this point, did our third map, we figured it out. We got it down to where it's pretty much a routine project. Now what we're dealing with are some of the standard program. You know, can we get the precast concrete members in time? what kind of design decision do we need to make to be able to get that precast order made. Just to show you on a couple of actual projects, this was a couple of interstate projects up in Detroit. These were the main goals that were set. These are the scopes of work. Unfortunately, the two projects weren't mutually exclusive. They were related. When we went through the complexity ratings, you can see on the I-75 one where our area went from 11,000 to 13,000 back to about 12,000. In between here and here, a technical issue came up that was not recognized in the early one, and that caused the complexity to go up. Now, by the time we hit the next year, they had resolved that particular technical issue, and you can see it's being moved down. The idea here is that as a project manager, even though we're not really using this as a quantitative type thing, what it does do is give us a bit of a dashboard. Are we managing complexity? What's the most complex dimension in this project today? What was it yesterday? Have these things changed? Has something come up that we haven't noticed? In the I-95 or I-94 one, you can see they gradually reduced the footprint, not by a whole lot, but they addressed complexity, in particular in finance and cost. That's where most of that was lying in that particular one. And so if you kind of summarize that case example, you can see the picture here. It's actually been, I believe it's almost complete. What we had here was this financing issue in I-94 that created a delay in the I-75 schedule. That was those, that's that value of having those maps. And then we also had some political issues that increased both projects' context dimensions. And so by effectively prioritizing project resources, we were able to reduce complexity of those projects and actually get them moved on and started. So what's the difference? I get into the cost and schedule certainty. We're going to shift from accuracy to enhanced certainty, accuracy being kind of the strike zone, that plus or minus number, whatever it is we want to hit, versus certainty being a credible range. The best, most likely, and worst case, and each case has a statistical level of confidence associated with it. When we do top-down estimating, what we really are doing is a dynamic estimate that allows us to start out with little technical detail and using data, excuse me, I had to hit that one, using data analysis and business analytics to come up with numbers. And as design decisions are made and more technical information is, we can then start replacing some of these plug numbers that we've gotten down to the top down with actual detailed estimates from the bottom up as we reach that point where we replace that and go all the way. Obviously, the key component is the cost database. This is an example of one that Gransberg and Associates did for the California Department of Transportation. You can see what we were doing here is giving them a range, rather than jumping in on the P80 as that's the estimate. The bottom line is that each project has its own level of risk, and it's unique. And by saying that all projects will be budgeted using P80, P70, P95, whatever it is, you're saying they all have the same level of risk and the same level uncertainty, which we know that's not true. Other things that the data can help us do as far as being able to make decisions. This again comes from the Caltrans unit price tool. What we entered at, we did this for every, I don't know, probably 500 different unit prices. And it became not an estimating tool, but a design tool. So if I'm doing, and I forget what we're looking at here exactly what this was, but let's just assume this is concrete pipe concrete pipe. Well, you can see it's really expensive in this part of the state. It's really cheap in this part of the state. So we need to be looking for a less costly alternative, perhaps, if we're building a project here, whereas it's a perfect one to do. And another one is my home state of Montana. You know, it has less than 1 million people. And they never, asphalt pavement is always cheaper than concrete pavement. But if you look at, advancing the data in this part of the state, concrete actually is more cost effective than asphalt. So all I'm doing is highlighting these tools that we talked about that allow us to make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. So what are the benefits? Communication. Really, project management, in my opinion, is nothing more than communication. All the quantitative things that we do because we're engineers and we like to crunch numbers are just the things we use to inform the communications that we need to make with other parties. This idea of early identification of complexity based on needs of a specific project, rather than waiting in a kind of a linear approach. Starting financials and those things, right there, not stopping with pro forma and then switching. Understanding the impact of context and availability of financing as drivers of the project. Identifying the critical success factors, is the critical success factor, fast, cheap, and wonderful, or is it we need to have this thing last 50 years? And then coming up with these balances and developing project action plans for success. And so with that, I'll just open it up to questions and clarifications. And before that, a little commercial for the AACE Tech Board. They're always looking for members who are interested in helping either develop or update professional practices guides, recommended practices, and other things in the area of their expertise. So I'm sure your chapter president can point you in the right direction if you feel like you'd like to contribute to the greater good of the profession by developing that. So with that, I'll open it up. Are we doing all the questions in the chat? Is that the plan?
Yes, thank you very much, Douglas, for your very informative presentation. So we are now open for the Q&A. So kindly unmute yourself to raise a questions, or you can type in your questions to our chat box. And Mr. Douglas is willing to answer.
Let me run up here to the top of the chat and see what we've got in terms of.
Likewise, don't forget to click the link for your certificate to receive your certificate of attendance for tonight's webinar. Okay.
Okay, well, it looks like one. It says, let's see here. What data, if I can get I have to make this box longer. Let's see, all right. What data do you need and how long does it take to prepare the complexity map? Well, it's really not any specific data, Mahmoud, but it's what it is you have to have the right people. So you need individuals that this is a consensus exercise of the project team. And so it's not just something that a project manager does in a vacuum sitting in a cubicle somewhere. We need to devote the time. We need to have somebody who understands the design, somebody that understands the cost and schedule, somebody that understands the legal contractual implications, all of those. And so what they do is work through the various components that are in that guidebook and discuss it. There's no school solution. And if you have one team rate a particular project and another team rate the exact same project, you cannot expect to get the same results, because it's going to be a function of that team's perception and that team's organizational maturity. How long does it take? In Georgia, we did 11 different projects, and we allowed a half a day for each one of those. I thought that was probably too short. In some of the other ones, we went ahead and allocated a full day, but it's not weeks. So hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, thank you. Anybody? Okay, so before we end, we would like to give a certificate of we share. Okay. So, in behalf of AACE, Arabian Section, present their certificate of appreciation to Douglas D. Gransberg for tonight's speaker for our technical webinar presentation on 5-dimensional project management strategies for complex projects, held virtually on Tuesday, September 27, 2022, 7 p.m. Riyadh time, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, signed by our President Al-Dusari. Thank you very much, Mr. Douglas. Okay. So no more
thank you
questions.
all very much too.
Okay, welcome. I think no questions anymore. So a kind reminder again. So don't forget to click the link in the chat box to receive your certificate of attendance for tonight's webinar.
Okay, ma salama.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
You
Thank
can
you,
give
sir.
chat if you're done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.